Well, hello, food friends. Food friends. I'm here to talk to you today about something very important, and that's urination. All right, whatever. Seriously, we've been talking about alcohol. Now we're going to fit this into why beer and alcohol in general can make you pee excessively. Maybe you knew this, maybe you didn't. This covers a number of important biochemical concepts, and it's just a framework. Hey, I do the best I can. Pee, urine. Why do we do it? Some interesting things actually are occurring here. First off, the kidneys are where things are at. The kidneys are responsible for a couple of things. And maybe you haven't really thought about this. One, they're responsible for the water salt balance in the body. And second, they're involved in removal of nitrogenous waste. Now let's think about food for a moment and what kinds of things we eat, what kind of things we generate. So we've gone through this. You're eating carbohydrate, sugars, and there's no nitrogen there. You're eating fats. Again, no nitrogen there. Now, happily, we're not talking about pooping, which is a whole other thing, but we never really get into that. The idea of a low residue diet is an interesting thing to think about. Like if you're going to go on a long space journey, you might want to consider this, but that's not what we're into. The point being, we can break these things down and you generate carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. You consume it in glycolysis. Now, on the other hand, what is a macromolecule that we've talked about that has an amine in it, an amino acid? Proteins. Proteins have got nitrogen in them, and consequently, you can pull and break the carbons apart, but you can't actually get rid of the nitrogen very well. So nitrogen can build up in the body, and it has to be removed. And this is something that all organisms have to deal with, nitrogenous waste. So what we're going to do is talk about these two things the kidneys are doing, kind of in reverse order. First, the main thing we have to say about removal of nitrogenous waste is the form of it, and that is urea. But here, let's think about this for a second. So we have to remove nitrogenous waste. Now, it turns out there are a couple of different forms of nitrogenous waste, or a couple of forms that nitrogenous waste can take, depending on what kind of organism you are. And here's some things that start to tie into evolution and the environment in which organisms find themselves. So, it's some just interesting things to think about. Fish. When a fish pees, it is peeing out ammonia, which is the NH4 ion. Now, an interesting thing to think about here is that fish are pulling the amine group out and they're dumping it without any carbon, which is really very efficient. All the carbon they're consuming, they can actually use as calories and blow off as carbon dioxide. The problem is that ammonia is very toxic and you can't store it very well. What fish do is they are constantly dumping ammonia out through their gills, and basically they're peeing all the time. They're in water, so they swim through it. The ammonia is very soluble in water, and they're basically swimming and peeing at the same time. Not going to work for us. All right. Now, birds and reptiles, they take a different approach. Their nitrogenous waste is a compound called uric acid, and it is essentially insoluble. And we'll see why this is critical in a moment. It does have carbon in it, so it's not the most metabolically efficient form of a nitrogenous waste, but it works for birds. This comes out basically as a paste. So birds don't tinkle, they have a squeeze. When you come out to your car and it's covered in white and you say, oh, a bird pooped in my car. No, that's not bird poop. Bird poop has got insect parts and things in it. It's a different color and you know that. The white stuff is bird pee. A bird peed on you, whatever. Now, for mammals, you and I, so this is birds and reptiles. We're kind of covering everybody. For mammals, our nitrogenous waste form is something called urea, which is a carbon-containing nitrogenous compound. And so again, it does require some carbon to put it out. That's carbon that you can't break apart to consume energy from. The difference between uric acid and urea is urea takes the exact opposite approach. It is very, and I mean very, water soluble. You can fill up a cup with urea and get it to go into solution by adding a few tablespoons of water. I mean, it's like really soluble. The reason I talk about the solubility is we need to be able to dump nitrogenous waste without dumping a lot of water, just in case we find ourselves in conditions where there isn't a lot of water. And that feeds back now into the kidneys and their water-salt balance. So let's get into that, shall we? All right. So the kidneys are responsible for maintaining a water-salt balance. And you might not think about this, but the salt concentration in your body is very carefully regulated, and it has to be. The salt concentration in your body is generally around 0.9% salt. Now, the reason this is so critical is that salt has a very critical influence on water movement. And here's why. There is a phenomenon that is critical in cell biology that is known as osmosis. What we're going to do is define osmosis and then take the definition apart a bit. Osmosis is defined as the diffusion of water across a semi-permeable membrane. So this is obviously a good definition to remember. The diffusion of water across a semi-permeable membrane. Now, we all know what water is. Good. Diffusion is a thermodynamic principle. It actually just happens. And we can define diffusion as this. And heck, I'll define it for you. All right, write it down. Diffusion is simply the movement of molecules from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. It is essentially the second law of thermodynamics, that that things tend towards disorganization. So if you've got a bottle of Old Spice aftershave and you pop the lid and put it over in a corner of the building or the room, after a while you begin to smell Old Spice aftershave over here. It diffuses. It's going from an area of high concentration, an area of higher organization, to an area of lower concentration over here in the corner. It is a thermodynamic principle. As you warm it up, it goes faster. As you cool it down, diffusion goes slower. And so this is the way molecules are going to move around depending on their concentration gradient. Now, an interesting thing happens when we introduce a semi-permeable membrane, that is a membrane around a cell. And let's think about this for a second. So we've got a cell, and cells are covered in the phospholipid bilayer. Remember that macromolecule? We got the phosphate head and the twin fatty acid tails. Now, this is well, it's got a charged part here. It's nonpolar, and so ions like salt, that is sodium and chlorine, they actually can't pass through that lipid bilayer. So salts are trapped on either side, on one side or the other, and they actually have to be physically pumped in using protein complexes. Now, what happens if we've got concentration gradients of salt on two different sides of this permeable membrane? Well, diffusion is going to happen, but it's going to be the diffusion of water because the salt can't diffuse. And it's really just, it actually comes down to the diffusion of molecules from higher concentration to lower concentration. That molecule is water. And you may not think about this, but if you've got salt in a beaker, there is less water per unit volume than there is in pure water. So just as an example, maybe you've experienced this before making some sort of powdered drink or something. You take a liter of water and you put in a cup of sugar. That's a fair amount. But you swirl it in a bit and then you pour it back into the liter bottle and whoosh, it's going to overflow. That's because the solid material, as it dissolves, actually displaces some of the water. It takes up space. Consequently, in that liter of sugar water, there is in fact less water than there is in pure water. So you have the water that's on the floor, or the fluid that's on the floor. That's the water that didn't get in. It changes the concentration of water. It's hard to think of it that way, but it is in fact what's happening. Now, just a general rule for myself, and feel free to take this up yourself, water moves towards salt. That's really all you need to know. Water follows salt. And it's like this. We have, say, a red blood cell drawn in blue, a little happy guy, and he is in a beaker of fluid, like your blood serum. And if it's 0.9% out here and 0.9% here, he is a happy guy. He's doing just fine. Water is just moving back and forth. Now, on the other hand, what if we take this and put this guy into pure water? No salt. So the concentration of water is higher outside than inside. Diffusion is going to cause water to diffuse across. And the other way of thinking of this is water follows salt. So water starts moving in. And because the salt can't diffuse out, the water moves in and the guy finds himself a little bit unhappy and then more and more unhappy and then, oh no, he pops and he's dead. Ooh. All right. Now, that's what happens when you take red blood cells and you introduce them to pure water. That's why when they give you an IV, make sure they're not putting in pure water. I mean, that'd be a bad thing if they did. It's going to be in a salt solution. Now, the opposite is happening. Let's redraw our friend here. So if we've got, say, here's our cell. He's a happy little fella. If we've got, let's say 10% salt out here. Water follows salt. And now in this case, the water starts to move out. And he's going to begin to shrivel. Oh no! He shrivels up. Now, some cells actually can shrivel up and actually come back. Part of it, though, is the salt concentration inside the cell starts to get too high. The proteins start to denature, and it may not make it. So don't try that on yourself. Now, as it turns out, our skin is actually fairly tough and impermeable to water, and so you don't swell up or contract with putting your hands in water. But as it turns out, we have just driven over the mechanism behind diarrhea. So you learn stuff. There are bacteria that can cause diarrhea, particularly really severe. And it works like this. You eat food, yum, yum, yum. It digests in your stomach. Your stomach is really just breaking it into small molecules. It goes into the small intestine, your food does, and that's really where all the nutrients are pulled out. You have a lot of water there, though. And you then go into the large intestine. The large intestine's job is to pull water out to give you a nice firm poop. Now, if you have a dog, then you think about this a lot. Or if you pay attention to your own body. I don't want to know. Now, pulling water out requires pulling salt out because water follows salt. So your large intestine is pulling the salt out of the poop to be. The water follows, and you end up with a nice firm little bolus, a poop. Bloop. All right. Now, if you have eaten foods with certain bacteria in them, there are bacteria toxins that will block the chloride transporters in your large intestine. You're not pumping salt out, and guess what happens? The water doesn't move out, and oopsie, you have watery stools. The problem with this is particularly it can lead to very severe dehydration really fast. Diarrhea, it's no joke. Yes, it is. Ooh, sorry. Now, let's see. Also, there are laxatives that are salt-based laxatives, like magnesium works really well. And you take a nice bolus glug of magnesium solution. Magnesium is not being pumped out nearly as well as chloride because your body doesn't really expect to have that much magnesium in it. And so the magnesium is still staying with your food in the large intestine. You pump the chloride out, but there's still a lot of salt. Water follows salt, and if you have enough, whoosh, you flush things right on out. There you go. You learned something. All right, so that is a critical reason why we have to maintain salt concentration. You can't allow the salt to get too high or too low. If it gets too high, you begin to shrink cells. If it gets too low, you begin to swell cells. Now, salt getting too low isn't too much of an issue. Let's think about sort of the evolution of our physiology. We really are going to be set up to where conditions are really, sketchy if there's not enough water to drink. That's what we're kind of, evolved for in terms of protection mechanisms. Water isn't available to the extent that we like. I'm thirsty, but there's no water. It's desert. I don't know what. It hadn't rained in a while. Now, a lot of water, you're basically left to your own responsibility. Don't drink so much because you make yourself sick. But not enough water, that's where the kidneys actually can play a role here. And it's like this. What the kidneys do is control water loss. Now here is another twist to this game that makes the kidneys' job that much more difficult. Respect your kidneys. They work hard for you. They got a tough job. When you consume salt, salty food, whatever, salt's all over the place, you can't dump salt very fast. Now, there are ocean-going birds, little seabirdies, that they actually drink seawater. Now, they use ATP-based sodium pumps to pump salt out, and they will develop little salt crystals on their little nosies. But you and I, we don't have a good way of dumping salt. If you're really sweating really hard, you can be dumping salt out from your sweat. But other than that, if you consume salt, you're going to hold it for a while. It takes a while to dump it out. So then what happens? If you have a lot of salt, your salt concentration starts to go up. You have to bring the water volume up. And this ties into a lot of things you may have experienced. Particularly as you get a little bit older and your blood pressure is not as stable as it was. Having real salty foods can raise your blood pressure up. Being dehydrated can begin to raise your blood pressure up. If you eat a lot of salty food, you might find that your rings don't fit off and on as easily as they do. You start to swell up. What you're doing is increasing blood volume to counteract the high salt you've got. Since you can't dump salt, you have to hold on to your water. All right. So the kidney's job is to monitor this. Now, the kidney is shaped, not surprisingly, like a kidney bean. Well, actually, the bean is named after the kidney. There's a fair amount of plumbing. The kidney's got a single tube, the ureter, that leads to the bladder. The bladder is a stretchy bag, and then you've got the urethra leading out to the outside world. All right. Just a little note, it's fairly easy to get a bladder infection because that actually is not that far away from the outside world. It's a little bit harder to get a kidney infection. Kidney infections, though, are damn serious. Bladder infections could lead to a kidney infection, so they are not very pleasant, but they are a lot easier to get than a kidney infection. Regardless, the bladder is a bag, kind of stretchy. An interesting game to see is how much water can you hold before you wet your pants. My record's about 1 liter. There you go. Try this at home. Good lab experiment. Drink a lot of fluid. See how much you can hold. We'll get into this in a moment. Don't drink too much pure water. If you're going to drink something, have a little bit of electrolyte in it, a little bit of Gatorade, whatever, if you're going to play this experiment. How much can you drink before you wet your pants? I don't want to know about it, or whatever. Sure, post it. Post pictures. The point is, the production of urine is happening in the kidney. The holding of it is happening in the urethra. Two completely separate issues. And that's why we're going to see the notion of breaking the seal. No, that has nothing to do with alcohol at all. And it really doesn't have any effect. That is the idea that if you're holding it, really holding it, and then you start, you go and tinkle, you're going to be peeing for the rest of the night. No, it's because of what you're drinking. Fascinating discussions, but for another point. Now, the kidney is a very complex tissue. It's one of the reasons why you can't really regrow a kidney. You have to have a kidney transplant. The liver, you can actually remove parts of it and it'll grow back. But the kidney, no, it's way more complicated structure. And it looks like this. It's got these two layers. There's an outer layer that is known as the cortex, and then an inner layer that is known as the medulla. And it is surrounded by, I don't know how many, hundreds, thousands of these tubes that are really responsible for the processing of urine. So we've got a whole bunch of these structures here that look like this. We're going to draw sort of a high mag, but they come down and back up. And then they have all these different collecting ducts that finally then do lead into the ureter. So you got all of these loopy guys floating around. Let's take a high mag of this spot, shall we? Because this structure that is collectively known as the nephron is really the business end of the kidney. So, it's like this. You got the top of the kidney, fine. And you have this kind of a cup. It's actually called the capsule. And then you've got this long tube that does this sort of U shape. And this capsule, or this cup right here, is known as the Bowman's capsule. And the Bowman's capsule is holding a kind of a wad of blood vessel. So you got blood vessel coming in here, and it's all wadded up and coming out. And the blood is under very high pressure right here. And it squeezes material out, and the Bowman's capsule captures it and puts it into this tube. This is known as the, I'm misspelling, is the descending loop of Henle. Not that you care, and I'm never going to ask you this level of detail, but just so you know, the descending loop of Henle right there, and this is the ascending loop. And what comes in here is actually not urine. It's not tinkle yet. It is referred to as filtrate. Now, the difference is filtrate has got stuff that you probably just assume want to keep. Filtrate is going to have glucose. It can have a variety of different vitamins and minerals, a variety of different metabolites, some protein subunits, i.e. amino acids, a whole range of different metabolites. It can also have a range of drugs, and of course it's going to have urea. Now, what's happening in the passage of filtrate in the descending loop is something that is known as a reuptake mechanism for a variety of things that you want to keep. So, glucose being one of them. Many vitamins, minerals, amino acid subunits. Probably this kind of stuff is not being taken back up. And by the time the filtrate goes down the loop and starts to make its way back up and then back down, it is no longer filtrate because you've pulled the stuff out. It actually magically transforms into what we call dilute urine. So this is now ready to be dumped out. The really interesting thing happens is, depending on your salt concentration of your blood, you can pull water out. Now, here's what starts to happen. Let's say it's a hot day and you're out working in the fields, you're sweating, you're spitting a lot, I don't know, you haven't had anything to drink, and you begin to lose water. You lose water from exhaling, all kinds of stuff, and your salt concentration starts to go up. Your body has to respond to this by not losing any more water in the processing of urine. That's why urea, being really water soluble, is critical, is you can begin to pull water out and make very concentrated pee. So what can happen then is we can have a lot of salt being dumped into the medulla. And remember, water follows salt, so the water starts moving out. And we now have gone from dilute urine to serious concentrated tinkle. I mean, we're talking weed killer, baby. Now, there's a limit to how much concentrated you can get, but you actually can surprisingly concentrate the heck out of your urine. You can dump a lot of urea with a very small amount of urine. Now, you got to kind of push yourself physiologically and get really dehydrated. Try this, don't do it at home. But your urine output can drop dramatically. And what you're doing is you're pulling every bit of water that you possibly can from this dilute urine, and you're holding it, you're storing it. And it's a way of trying to maintain your blood salt balance. Now, if you don't get some water before too long, well, I don't want to speak for what will happen because it ain't going to be good. Your urine output begins to kind of shut down to zero, a few drops, but you start running low on water. And then there's a whole other problem. It's like your brain's saying, dude, you better get something to drink fast because things are getting bad. I'm doing all I can do. It's up to you now to get some water. All right. Turns out there is a very specific hormone that is responsible for this water in the medulla and pulling out. It is a hormone known as anti-diuretic hormone. abbreviated in the biz as ADH. Antidiuretic hormone is secreted by the brain. You actually have a portion of the brain that is serving as an osmometer, or measuring the osmolarity, as it's called. That is, the degree of salt that's in the blood. If the salt starts to get too high, kind of above the set point, it kicks the thermostat on, the brain will secrete ADH. That causes salt to be dumped into the medulla. You begin concentrating your pee. And now here is the thing with alcohol. One of the first things that alcohol does, and you know this perhaps because of freshman alcohol training, alcohol is a pretty significant anesthetic. And one of the first things it does, in addition to numbing your ability to control your speech and causing you to chatter, or in my case, I get sad and go sit in the corner, alcohol inhibits ADH release. Let's see what happens if we do that. So, it doesn't take much alcohol to inhibit ADH release. And when that happens, you lose the brakes on urine output. And all of a sudden, without ADH, you don't have any salt in the medulla, you're pulling the material out of the filtrate, but rather than concentrating the urine, you're peeing very dilute urine. Herein lies the problem. You're drinking and you're eating salty food. Now, as I say this, I'm thinking pre-COVID, you go to a bar or you go to Pizza Hut and you order a pizza and beer. You're eating salty food, drinking alcohol. This is a combination for pretty serious dehydration, because the salt that you're consuming starts to raise your salt concentration up in your blood. The alcohol that you're consuming causes you to begin peeing out very dilute urine. You're not pulling water out. You're dehydrating yourself from two different ends: increased salt and losing water really rapidly. Woo! That's a good way to get a hangover. In terms of not getting a hangover, about the best thing you could do is, drink a ton of water, be super well hydrated, and then start drinking, maybe. But in terms of getting a really good hangover, dehydrate yourself at the beginning of the day, eat a lot of salty food to increase your salt concentration, and then drink liquor in very concentrated forms. Now that will give you a hell of a hangover. Sorry. But that's actually what's happening, is the alcohol is blocking ADH release. That in turn allows for an increased urine output, which is dehydrating you further. And that's what is going to happen. Now, the reason behind this is, or one of the, not the reason, but an interesting evolutionary strategy is, when things get rough, you run out of water, you begin secreting ADH. You pull the water out of your urine, and you thereby conserve water. There are desert-dwelling animals, like little hamsters, that have what are called extramedullary nephrons. Their nephrons go deep into the medulla of their kidney, and that way they can pull out as much water. Now, I've never watched a hamster pee, but they have very concentrated urine. A few dribbles. Beep, 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 beep. And it is said, again, I've never talked to a hamster, they actually can obtain sufficient water through metabolic water, that is, consuming food and breathing oxygen. The final electron acceptor being oxygen, they turn it into water, and man, they hold on to that water. So they really don't need to actually drink water. They get enough water from metabolism and from the moisture in the food, and they pee just a little bit. Blink. So, there are other animals like nutria rats that lives in the swamps of Louisiana that are, like swamp-dwelling animals. And they have the exact opposite problem. They actually have a lot of water all the time kind of coming in. And so they're very good at peeing out really dilute urine. So, in terms of who can pee the most, put your money on the nutria rat, not on the gerbil. All right, let's see. Now, a couple of other interesting physiological phenomena that happen. Because evolutionarily, our bodies are set for conditions of thirst and dehydration. We ain't got really good tools for excessive hydration, and this actually can present a problem. Now, it's kind of like evolutionarily, you're set to survive as well as you can in conditions of low water. If you got a ton of water, it's up to the user to be responsible and not drink too much of it because you'll make yourself sick and you kill yourself stupid. So, things that people can do or have done is drink like a gallon of water really fast. And you begin pulling that into your body from the stomach and from the large intestine. You actually can begin to drop the concentration of salt. This is a phenomenon that is actually quite dangerous. It is known as hypo or low natremia. And hyponatremia will cause your heart to go into fibrillation, and it'll cause your heart to stop pretty seriously. Hyponatremia is not a joke. There was one of the first times I saw it, and it became something that doctors began to recognize, was like around '05 or so. A Chicago Marathon, which is usually run in October, it was a particularly warm October. And it turns out that when you're really exercising hard, like running a marathon, your kidneys actually begin to shut down. And so there was a person that was drinking at all the little water stops along the way and not peeing, but not really noticing this, came into the end of the marathon and was feeling kind of weird, walks into the first aid tent. Now, their immediate assumption, it's like 85 degrees, is, oh, you must be dehydrated. And they started giving her water, and she went into fibrillation, and I'm not sure whatever happened to her, no, but it was very severe. And they realized, oh, it wasn't that she had too little water, it was that her salt concentration was too low. What they should have done was put her on drugs that are called diuretics to get your kidneys to start dumping fluid and given her salt. But I don't know if they're doing this or not. Those of you that run marathons, maybe you've seen this. But they talked about the idea, a way of dealing with this would be to have a starting weight that you put on your chest, how much you weigh, and then at the end of the race, if you're feeling a little wobbly, they put you back on a scale, and if you're hyponatremic, you're going to be weighing a good bit more because water is pretty heavy. And so if you weigh less than your starting weight, obviously you're dehydrated. Here, have a drink. If you weigh more, let's get you to the hospital because we need to pump you with some potassium and get you up and rolling. So that's the moral of the story. Students anyway, will occasionally have contests to see who can drink a large amount of fluid the fastest. Doing that with water is a little bit dangerous. I think you probably will throw up most of the time before you can get to a spot that you make yourself hyponatremic. Someone had pointed out an article several years ago about it was like Hold Your Pee for the Wii. A radio station was having some kind of contest for the gaming system, the Wii, which I never figured out as a name, whatever. But it was going to be how long can you hold your pee, and they had made them drink a gallon of water, and out in the lobby somebody went into heart failure and may have died. It's like, not a good contest. So if you are going to do a how fast and how much fluid can you drink and hold game, do it with something that's got some salt, primarily, hopefully potassium in it. Milk would be interesting, but man, that would be nasty. A Gatorade type thing, Pedialyte, that kind of stuff. It's one of the things that with these sort of athletic or performance fluids, whatever they call them, they are supposed to have electrolytes in them, yeah? All right. So some of you guys that are serious athletes actually may have real electrolyte fluids. Gatorade used to actually be an electrolyte-containing solution. And it had magnesium and particularly potassium. Potassium is one of the really critical ions. And it had glucose in it. And this was back like in the late 60s when it first came out. And it was developed by Florida State or something like this, some football team in Florida, whoever the Gators are, I don't know. And it was actually a legitimate drink. It was something interesting. Nowadays, it really is no different than any other soda. They don't even use glucose anymore. It's high fructose corn syrup. The amount of salt in it is negligible. It's like stupid. But go figure, they sell it. Now, there are solutions, things like Pedialyte, stuff like that, that do have a higher concentration of salt. And those are the things that you can consume, and they'll maintain your salt concentration. But that should be a lesson to you then. If you're going to do any kind of large volume of drinking contests, make sure you have a little bit of salt in it. Or you drink something with a little bit of salt, and then you have your roommate drink something with just pure water, and then watch as hilarity ensues. I never said that. Oh God, this is recorded now. No, it was not my idea. Hey, hopefully you're doing the test, the exam. It's pretty simple, I hope. Please. We will probably put together a little kind of a take-homey type thing, but you're home. Rather than an exam, an essay type thing that you'll answer some questions, some short answer questions. And then we're working our way through some interesting topics that we're going to then put into the final exam. Now, just as a little pre-system to think about, glucose uptake is going to play into our story about diabetes. Diabetes is often diagnosed because the individual will have glucose in their urine. And that's like one of the first obvious symptoms that you have uncontrolled blood glucose levels. We'll see how that plays in. Probably next week we start talking about a few more things. All right, so that's about all I have to say. Thanks for listening, and I'll check in with you later. Peace.